Hey there! Thanks for tuning into Duckbricks. I'm Chris and welcome to another episode of Bionicle Fanon Reviews, the show where I review the fan-created, canonized Bionicle models. These are stuff that have been accepted into official Bionicle canon via LEGO-sponsored contests like the Dark Hunter and Rahi contest of 2005, or even more modern stuff like the TTV canonization contests, which are actually currently still ongoing. Now, these models in particular have a pretty interesting backstory as to how they were canonized. Their characters first appeared in story serials and books that came out around 2009, and eventually their appearances were accepted into canon via unofficial fan contests, which Greg Farshtey later retroactively made canon. Stuff like the Third Man contest for Kirbold here, or the Century contest for Kiri here, which are actually hosted on different Bionicle sites like BZ Power. These canonizations happened during a pretty strange time in Bionicle's history where LEGO wasn't doing any official canon contests, but the story team was still willing to accept some fan images into canon. And so, that's how we have these two Agori represented in physical form. Now, I decided to review both of these at once because of course they're very small builds, and one of them is almost basically just the bog standard Agori build or Avmatoran build you could get, so there isn't really too much going on with one of them. The other one is a little more interesting, but I figured that it wasn't enough for a full video, so I wanted to group them together because they kind of are the odd ones out in this whole canonization process. So the first character here is Kirbold. Kirbold actually served a somewhat major role in the story serial Riddle of the Great Beings. He assisted some other Agori like Tarduk and Crotetius in a search for the Maze of the Great Beings. They encountered warriors like Sorel and the Iron Wolves along the way, and also fought the Element Lords and barely escaped with their lives. So really, that's all you kind of need to know about Kirbold here. He's just an Ice Agori. And moving on to Kiri over here, Kiri actually played a relatively large role in the novel that came out around 2009, Raid on Volcanus, which detailed the Bone Hunters' attack on the Fire City of Volcanus and how all the Glatorian banded together to stop it. Specifically, Kiri was the one who recounted the tale and shared the legend of the Raid of Volcanus, which united all Glatorian from all separate tribes to defend one city, all to support the veteran Glatorian Akar. So with their backstories out of the way, it's time to discuss how I review all of these models. I review them by 4 points. Number 1 is posability. So can I get them into good poses? Do they look cool in action poses? Or can they not support the weight of their own weapons or keep falling over? Number 2 is building techniques. So am I generally impressed by the building techniques that went into these models, or are they just recycling stuff from the official sets? Number 3 is overall aesthetics, so completely ignoring their appearance in the story and backstory given to them. Do they generally look cohesive? Do they have good color schemes? And do they look cool or look like standard villagers? And finally, number 4 is believability in universe. So compared to other representative samples in the Bionicle universe, do they make sense and do they fit in alongside their comrades? So this probably goes without saying, but I will be reviewing these two separately. They'll each get a different score at the end of the review because they are pretty different builds. We'll start off first with Kirbold, and then we're going to move on to Kyry at the end. And so without further ado, let's just jump over to the review studio and check out this 2-pack special of 2 different canonized Agori models. Okay, so here we have our pair of Agori. This one right here is Kirbold, and this one is Kyry. So we're going to start off this review by taking a look at the much simpler one first. Kirbold here was actually canonized by a drawing, which is why he's very simplistic. He was literally drawn to just be a standard Agori build, but with elbows, which honestly isn't too hard to achieve. And to be completely honest, there's not too much I can even say about this guy, because as you can see, he's just your standard Avmatoran build with elbows that are honestly stuff that make his limbs a little bit too long. We'll get to that in a second though, and just start off with posability. So posability is basically about what you'd expect. You can see he uses these standard Avmatoran limbs, so obviously there's no knee articulation here. You can just move it up and down like so, rotate around his foot, and then when you go up to his head, he also again has just the standard head that many of the other Agori used during the 2009 Bionicle era. Now of course the only interesting and unique thing about him are the arms, and as you can see here, they're not too complex, and to be completely honest, I am not the biggest fan of how the articulation was achieved here, because if you look first if he has his arms completely straight, that means his proportions are really off. His arms are so lanky that they just go straight down almost to his feet, so
Right off the bat, the amount of extra articulation that you give him using these two pieces just make his arms really elongated. But that's honestly not the biggest problem. My biggest problem is that if you actually want to give him articulation, you can't because of the way the arms are set up. Really, he can only cross his arms, which is how the joint works, or maybe if you kind of angle this one out, he can have his arm bent like so, but then he can't actually ever just bend his arms straight 90 degrees. Either this side right here will be hitting the axle there, or if you turn this the way it's supposed to be, then this side will be hitting the axle right here. So for all of the strangeness that it gives the model to give a figure of this size articulation, it honestly doesn't even really work too well, because he can't really articulate his arms besides a very fixed range of motion. You're about to see an Agori that accomplishes the same exact thing with a much more compact design, which gives it more articulation, which is why this one I'm going to be particularly rough on, because it is physically possible to give someone articulation with this amount of space, they just chose not to do it. So he does have a little bit of a dagger as well. This is basically just a standard lance piece from the Kopaka Nuva Fentoka set, so you can see that right here, nothing you really haven't seen before. And of course, as you turn him around, it's just a basic Agori build. There's not too much more I can say about the posability. Now, aesthetically speaking, I think that the color scheme is also fairly bland and uninteresting because he's really just gray and white. It kind of reminds me of Solek, which is not a good thing that you want to be reminding me of. He really just has a pretty standard color scheme. Sure, his feet are black, which I guess adds some sort of variability, and his helmet is silver, but honestly, if you look at him, it's just a lot of gray and a lot of white, and that's not a very engaging color scheme. Now, I understand that in the constraints of the story, he had to be an Agori of ice, so I see why they actually gave him this color scheme, but you could have probably done something a little bit more interesting than just this standard design, because if anything, this just looks almost like a standard filler character that you'd see in the background of an Agori crowd, and not actually one of the more important named Agori. In fact, this guy actually went on the quest for the Riddle of the Great Beings and played a fairly significant role in that story, and he just doesn't really stand out too much, and doesn't really actually look like he'd be the main character of one of these story serials, which is pretty disappointing to me personally. Still though, it's nice to actually get some sort of background Agori, just some stuff that flesh out the world a little bit more so you aren't just stuck with the main Agori that we eventually got in the 2009 sets, so it's nice to actually get an addition to those, although I will say this one is not too great. So we've talked about building techniques, posability, and aesthetics for this guy. It's only been a couple of minutes, but I honestly feel like there's nothing more to say, so we can probably set him aside and move on to the much more interesting Agori, which is Kiri right here. So right off the bat, you'll notice that Kiri has a much more engaging color scheme. Sure, they use the same exact torso piece, but Kiri actually has a lot more detailing on his chest, and even as you go onto the back, the builder made some efforts to actually include some extra pieces to add some sort of a color to the back of the color scheme here. They definitely didn't need to do that, but it is much appreciated, and it's really cool actually having them add some sort of color to this model. Now immediately, as you can see here, I do just want to start off with posability, and posability is pretty good, because this isn't Agori, the proportions are not too bad, but he actually has knee articulation. So you can see you can really just bend that knee completely as you would expect, which is really nice to see. Of course, you can still rotate the foot as well, so that all has good articulation. It just uses a very standard Technic and ball joint kind of system right here. And the same exact setup is extended to the arms, where you can see he can bend his elbows, and thankfully his arms are not too long. They're not nearly as long as Kirbold's, but they still do the trick for the most part. Now, one thing I will say is that they wanted to try to bulk up the arms a little bit, so they used the Technic cam pieces instead of just the standard Technic linkages, which you can see here. An unfortunate side effect of that is, though, that the cam pieces actually kind of hit the armor piece right here, so he can't actually bend his arm to a 90-degree position. The cam piece actually prevents him from doing that, which is a little bit unfortunate, but it's not a big deal. I'm just glad he actually does have articulation without the arms being super lanky or looking super awkward. Of course, the head just basically has the standard amount of articulation. I do like the use of the Ranu helmet, but just backwards, because of course if he was wearing it the right side up, it would just look like a better version of Ranu, but here he actually has some sort of unique character to him, and it actually looks like he's wearing some sort of a sun visor on the front here, because of the way that the fire pieces on the back of Ranu's helmet work. All in all, it actually gives him a pretty interesting look and feel and silhouette, and he's definitely the best Agori / Avmatoran scaled build that we've gotten in a long time. And of course, speaking of the build, we can probably move on from posability to building techniques. You can see right here that he uses this sort of shield element. It's very simple, just using some 1x5 technic beams, some armor pieces, and some of the Pohatu climbing claws, but it works out pretty well, and I'm pretty happy with how this one turned out. It actually does look like some sort of a shield, like a Roman commander or legionnaire shield, just something that's pretty useful. One thing I will note though is that unfortunately the connection between the ball joint and this axle here is not particularly strong, especially if you use the standard ball joints like you're supposed to. It's very easy to, while you're posing him around or moving around the shield or the sword, just to make it pop right out, depending on how strong your joints are. So just keep that in mind when you're posing this around. Of course, his other arm is just using a standard sword. This is reusing the Kopaka sword element from the Toamata, which was recolored in Keat Orange for the beak of the Gecko bird, which is actually one that fits in quite well with the color scheme, because a lot of this is actually Keat Orange or orange itself, as you can see right here. Now moving on to the other building techniques, of course this is very simple. You can't really do too much with an Agori build. But honestly, I'm very happy with the building techniques used here. I love the way the color scheme blends in with the dark red and Keat Orange. It really does look quite vibrant for an Agori type of build, and I do especially love the detail added onto the chest here, which really sets us apart from most of the other Agori. It really does feel like something special to have just a little bit of amount of color in these splashes of dark red and Keat Orange here that set it apart from the rest. Now, of course, this is not without its flaws. You can't really articulate the feet beyond just this range of motion side to side just because of the way they're mounted. It's also really easy to accidentally get this kind of loose or out of alignment, or to kind of open up the Technic axle here. It's not the most solid of builds, but it's not too fragile either, and as long as you're somewhat careful with it, it's not really going to fall apart. Of course, my biggest complaint is this being really easy to separate, as well as this kind of limiting the articulation here. I probably would have been just fine with the 1x3 Technic beams. I don't necessarily know if it needed this more bulky Technic cam piece, but I can see why they chose to do it, and unfortunately that is something that does constrain articulation a little bit. What's really nice though is that you can actually get this into a variety of really cool looking poses, and for an Agori type of build, that's not something I really say too often. Because of just how much the legs bend, you can really get him to act in all sorts of different poses and a variety of different things. It's just really cool that you can see he can bend his legs literally just purely 90 degrees and have a lot more dynamic action poses than you would expect out of many of the other Agori builds. This easily is the best build of its scale that was officially inducted into Bionicle canon. It's easily the best among the Agori and Avmatoran builds, especially compared to the official sets, and I'm pretty happy with exactly how this one came together, and actually would recommend building it yourself if you were interested in doing so. But with that, we can probably zoom out and take a look at both of these Agori next to some representative samples from the Bionicle universe. So let's do that right now and jump backwards.
Alright, so here we are with the Agori Kirbold and Kiri right here. You can see I've brought alongside some other representative samples from the Bionicle universe, namely Crotetius and Tarduck from the Riddle of the Great Being story serial. These three are kind of in their own grouping right here. And for Kiri here, I've brought alongside the leader of the Volcanus village, the Agori Ranu, just to showcase how they complement each other. And I've also brought alongside a random Glatorian, in this case Teryx, to just show some size comparisons. So obviously, you can see that they are pretty believable in universe. Their scale is basically the same scale as other General Agori, especially for Kirbold here, who again is almost basically just a regular Avmatoran build. For Kiri here, despite him doing completely different things for the limbs and having different elements of articulation, he still manages to retain approximately the same height as the other Agori, which is something I do appreciate. He's not too big to make it unbelievable. And of course, they scale perfectly well alongside a Glatorian as well. And so, for believability in universe, I'm going to first start off with Kirbold and then go to Kiri. So Kirbold here is very believable in universe. And that's not necessarily a good thing because it doesn't really do too much else outside of just a standard Agori build. He basically, for all intents and purposes, is just the same exact build as many of the other Agori with different colors swapped. The only unique thing he has are the articulatable elbows, which Again, add a little bit to him, but also make his arms pretty lanky and long compared to the other characters. But they're not too long, so it is still pretty believable. And that's why for Kirbold, I'll give him a 9 out of 10 in terms of believability in universe. He's literally just an Agori build with some strangely extra long arms. As for Kiri here though, he's a little less believable. And again, not necessarily a bad thing, because the builder actually went out and did some pretty unique things in terms of giving him full articulation. You've got knee articulation, elbow articulation, all these different colors that make him feel a lot more vibrant, but still fitting into the world of the Agori. But unfortunately, because he's just so much more articulated and detailed than every other Agori build, which is not a bad thing, the believability in universe score goes down a little bit. I'm just going to give it an 8 out of 10 because while he does scale fine next to the other Agori, he's clearly just so much more of a sophisticated build with so much more detail that it almost feels a little out of place. But now, setting aside the representative samples from the universe, it's time to take a look at just these two Agori by themselves and finish ranking up the final points of this review. So, Kirbold is going to be easy, so I'm going to do him first. Number 1, Posability. Supposability is just an Avmatoran with a little extra added on. The legs, you can't move the knees, you just have the standard amount of posability you would expect. The arms actually do have elbows, but again, as I mentioned in the review, the elbows are not particularly easy to articulate, just because of the way they're mounted. You kind of have a fixed degree of articulation unless you make him cross his arms, which he can definitely do very well, but if you want him to have a perfectly right angle like this, you really have to stick it out to the side because otherwise that's just not going to work out too well. A side effect of this is that again his limbs are very lanky, but we'll get to that when we discuss aesthetics. Of course, everything else about him is just standard. His head, just a basic Agori. And so, for posability, I'm going to give Kirbold a 6 out of 10. He is just a little above average because he can articulate his elbows. The Avmatoran or Agori builds were never my personal favorite builds because of how limiting they were in terms of articulation. I honestly much preferred a lot of the older Matoran builds, which actually did a few different things and actually had you build up a character. With this, it's just the bare minimum required to create a character, so that's why I think it doesn't really have too much in terms of posability. Moving on though to building techniques. Again, not too much I can say about Kirbold here. He uses basically just a standard Avmatoran build from the other sets. And really the only difference in the building techniques again is just this elbow, which honestly I feel maybe could have been done a little bit better. I mean, Kiri over here shows you a much better elbow building technique using just a few more technic pieces. With this building technique, the articulation, while still more than the standard Agori, is pretty limited just because of the way the pieces work, and again, you can't really do too much with it because he just can bend the elbows very ever so slightly. And so, building techniques, I was not too impressed. I'm going to give this one a 4 out of 10. Of course, it is built well to fit in with the rest of Agori. It makes sense that this would be another Agori, but I just think that it could have been a little bit better if you wanted to have a canonized Agori. And finally, moving on to aesthetics, Kirbold here is just basically fine, I think. Nothing too crazy going on. I think the color scheme is alright. I would have preferred if the feet were a different color other than black, because I do feel like the black feet don't necessarily fit in well with the dark gray and the white. And to be honest, it's just kind of a pretty boring and uninteresting color scheme. He's just got the dark gray body and the white limbs, and that's really all there is to it. I'm honestly not too interested by this color scheme in particular. It's not very vibrant, and it doesn't really stand out compared to many other characters. Now, of course, many Bionicle sets, like Solek for instance, had this exact problem, but that doesn't excuse this from also just not having a vibrant color scheme. And so, all in all, I think general aesthetics, I'm going to give Kirbold a 4 out of 10. Nothing I'm too impressed with, not a huge fan of this one, not even really sure how or why this particular build was even canonized in the first place. But then moving on, we can talk about Kiri. Now obviously, I like this one a lot more on almost every point. Starting off with posability, you were able to cram in a ton of posability for just one Agori character. Sure, he can move his elbow up all the way because of the way the pieces were used, but everything else is pretty much perfect. He can bend the legs all completely with a full knee, bend the feet, the head, everything is fully posable for something this small. I think is really impressive. Of course, the techniques used to make it are pretty simple, but I still think it's very good to have a build like this, And that's why I'm going to give general posability an 8 out of 10. And now I will want to preface this by saying this is in comparison to all the other Agori, which, if we pull them up right here, just have the no degrees of articulation for the knees and no degrees of articulation for the elbows. So anything beyond that is a major step up. And this one really impressed me with the amount of articulation they managed to pack into just one very small character. Now moving on to building techniques. Again, the building techniques are nothing too special. They're very basic building techniques, but they really work out well together, and I think that the combination of different pieces really makes this character stand out. They're not just using the standard Avmator torso, they're actually doing some unique things on the chest using a very few pieces to actually create a different look. Even the back has this dark red beam just to make it stand out a little bit more. And the weapons themselves, I think the build for the shield is quite good. I do love the way that it incorporates the armor pieces and the claw pieces, as well as the use of the Guckobird beak or Kopaka sword as his sword using the Kid orange color or the orange color here, which I think works out very well as well. And so building techniques, while they're not the most advanced, are quite good, especially for an Agori size build. And that's why I'm going to give building techniques a 7 out of 10 for this fantastic little model, which really goes to show that size is not everything. And finally, moving on to overall aesthetics. Now, in general, I'm pretty happy with the way this looks. The color scheme is fantastic, and especially if you compare him against another member of the Fire Tribe, he definitely shares a similar design principle with the dark red and the Kid orange being the primary colors, but that's honestly where the similarities end, and he really does his own thing of blending different shades of colors in together. You've got dark red armor pieces with Kid orange lower pieces, you've got dark red beams attached to Kid orange feet and Kid orange upper legs, and even the torso as well. You've got a mix between the dark red and the yellowish color right here, or the flame yellowish orange. I really like the choice of actually making the shield have these colors as well. Really does make him feel like very realistic, and in general, I'm very happy with the color scheme for this build, and it's probably the best Agori build and the best canonized small build I've seen for any sort of Bionicle contest. And that's why I'm going to give aesthetics an 8 out of 10. And with that, we have completely summarized these two Agori on the planet of Bara Magna. Let me know down in the comments below, what do you think of these builds? Have you built them yourselves? And if so, do you like them or dislike them? And do you agree or disagree with my points? As always, stay tuned every single Monday for a brand new Bionicle fan and review. Thank you so much for tuning in, and I'll talk to you again very soon. Bye bye for now.